a Zoom event is that we're able to include speakers from abroad. So our first speaker is Professor Joni Adamson, who is a professor of the Environmental Humanities in the English department at Arizona State University. She's also a senior sustainability scholar and director of the Environmental Humanities Initiative, as well as a Plus Alliance Fellow. She has many areas of research interest, but of particular interest to us tonight are her food sovereignty and food security. We also have with us this evening Naeema Gabru, who is a senior lecturer at Northwest University and is also a practicing attorney at her own firm and a beekeeper. So very exciting to have these two speakers with us this evening, who I'm sure will share very interesting perspectives on the film. So where I'd like to start is just with a general discussion from each of you, please, to let us know what your connection is to the honey industry and to bees as a part of the global natural ecosystem, and what your reflections on the film were. Joni, I think we can start with you, if that's fine.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that introduction. I think you did a very good job of introducing who I am. I have less sort of intricate knowledge of bees than I do of just the concept of food justice, food sovereignty. I'm a professor of the environmental humanities, and so one of the things that I do is I teach classes where we use literature, film, history, philosophy, and ethics to look at climate change sort of broadly. And about 10 years ago, I discovered that students opened up their minds so much more broadly to understanding the issues around climate change when you narrowed the focus onto food and food justice. So I think because everybody eats, everybody must eat every day, and it's something that they will open their minds to understand. I learned that you could start teaching films about food justice, and food sovereignty, and get a much more deeper understanding of the issues. So if the issues around food have to do with, first, imperialism, that's where we start. We start with imperialism, because if you look sort of evolutionarily and through deep time, what you see is that humans have evolved in relationship to birds, animals, and tastes. So humans have evolved in relationship to sweet. And it is really amazing. And one of the things I like to point out to my students is that all of our planetary global processes have changed because humans are so driven by a need for sweet. So you can sort of link the entire sort of imperial sugar industry and plantation industry to humans and their desire for sweet. And so sugar in the tea, the British started imperially sort of collecting tea and then putting sugar in the tea. And this drove a whole sort of imperial and colonial system over the course of 500 years, from the removal of people, even people, from one continent to another, to sort of be the labor source. And that led to all kinds of processes, global processes, that we still are being impacted with today. Even if you look at the coronavirus was driven by illegal trafficking in food products, including meat products. And so if we look at the illegal trafficking of all kinds of exotic animals, essentially what we'll do is we'll find humans and their desires at the sort of bottom of a kind of chain of events, historical, ethical, philosophical, that have driven literally the changing of the planetary processes to and including climate change. So my relationship to the film is a teaching relationship that I sort of ask my students to look at with human desire for sweet, salt, fat, and sour, and just the way we've put together our culinary dishes, the foods that are meaningful, culturally meaningful to us. And honey is definitely a culturally meaningful food. And essentially what we saw is different relationships to honey from around the world, and a 9,000 year practice between humans and bees. And so one of the things I ask my students to do is look at the way in which humans have evolved these multi-species relationships. So whether it's with bees or cattle, we have multi-species relationships that have shaped who we are as people, and shape our everyday practices as well. The film was interesting to me because I thought it was really interesting the way the filmmakers traced the honey industry around the world. I guess I was a little bit disappointed in the film because it didn't really talk beyond the things that were illegal to sort of giving us a sense of what we could do to sort of fight back, or purchase more ethical products. And so I would have liked to have seen the filmmakers tell us more about what we could do as consumers to help beekeepers with their industry, to sort of fight back with the parts of the industry that are adulterating the honey. And so I'm thinking that I can see from the participant list that there are people in the Zoom room that actually have experience with beekeeping, and I'm looking forward to hearing what they thought about that. So that would be one question I would have about the film, is just beyond what the illegal practices are, what can we do to support food justice, food sovereignty, and especially the sovereignty of beekeepers and people who are trying to take care of the health of bees around the world, and make sure that that beekeeping practices and the honey industry can continue. So food sovereignty means that everybody has the right to continue their culturally meaningful practices, whether that's bee and honey production, or production of corn and other quote unquote sacred foods to different people around the world. I'm looking forward to hearing what people have to say about how we can help. So that's I think that's enough from me today, and I'll turn the mic over to the next person.
Thanks, Joni. Yes, you've picked up on a number of points that I found quite fascinating. You speak about the multi-species relationships and how they shape us, whereas something that struck me particularly about the film was the way we shape those relationships. Just looking at how the bees, when they're not producing honey, are then manipulated to pollinate almond orchards was something that I found quite striking. But I'd like to give Naeema, please, a chance to also share her experience and her insights on the film with us.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you so much, all of you, for having me and for wanting to hear from me. I am a small-time beekeeper. It is my passion, and I'm going to ask if we could please share. I've prepared a small little presentation just so that you could see where I'm coming from and what I do. So if we could try and just share it. I see my screen sharing has been disabled, so I'm unable to share it, if possible. While we're waiting for that, I am a Muslim, practicing Muslim, and in our Quran we have a surah, a chapter that deals with bees. So naturally, when I look at my worldview and I look at the sources of my religion and what shapes me as a person, I was always fascinated by bees and the sacredness and the healing powers that we get from honey itself. And when I watched the film, I noticed the gentleman spoke about the romance with bees. And that really stuck with me, because that's something that I am totally intrigued with the bees. I remember the first time I actually did a bee removal, I got stung so badly and I was so swollen for almost a whole week. And later on I read that the bees, if we read a certain, if we chant from the, almost like a peace and blessings to our prophet, you would not be stung. And religiously, this is what I actually do when I work with my bees, and hold and behold, never been stung again so far while I'm actually working in the beehive. Also, what was nice for me about the film is being a beekeeper, it seemed as if though my story was being told all over again. Even though it's a small-time beekeeper, I started a good few years ago, maybe around 2012. I had tried to purchase some hives from a family that was struggling financially, and hopefully to boost my beekeeping, I had purchased 600 hives from them, and I had put them over on different farms and farmlands within the Northwest province here in South Africa. And everything seemed to be working quite well. The bees were producing. Idea was not to chase and not to do pollination. So ours was just basically for honey. But where the gentleman said he went back and he seen that there were no bees, I lived that. So it was about 11 o'clock in the evening, and I was doing rounds because we usually work with our bees in the evenings. And I was doing rounds, busy checking on the hives. And every site that I got to, there were no bees. And I was horrified because not only the financial loss, but also what actually has happened. And then at about 10 to 12 the evening, I realized that I'd actually put my own life in danger, because I was on a foreign farm where the owner knew who I was, but I'd actually stumbled upon this cartel that was busy stealing my bees and my hives. And I had no weapons on me, I had nothing. And I'd realized that this could be the end, and what now? So what they actually did is they knew how to work with bees, and they just unpacked my hives into their own, and they basically set my hives alight. So when we talk about the industry and how manipulated it is, the adulterated honey is something totally different. But for upcoming beekeepers where you're just trying to do something small, in my case, more of a hobby than a commercial business, it was really difficult to survive and come back from losing all of those hives. But we persevered, and I managed to build up the hive numbers again, and I've decided to keep it small. So I've got about 100 hives currently that my dad and myself we get about 500 kilos of honey in a season, but we're not chasing, so we're not pollinating. We're not going to move them and follow the flowers or the flowering of the flowers. We're leaving them just basically to nature to be able to do whatever they need to, and open them, check on them, and remove the honey that we can get from them. The bees for me is really interesting. I learn from them every single day, every time I'm out with them. It's a peace of mind away from my work environment when I'm with them. It's as if though they have a language of their own. Sadly for me in South Africa is when you want to keep hives, we've got some acts that deals with it. So basically we need to be registered with the Department of Agriculture and Forestries. It's an annual registration. Your boxes or your hives needs to be numbered. So you think that if something happens in the form of theft, it's easy to actually locate these hives. Believe you me, I've reported the cases on more than one occasion, and we've heard absolutely nothing. So I find that even though we have the laws there, there's not enough in place to be able to assist the conservation of the beekeeping industry in our country at present. Also with the different legislation, it's not only about keeping the hives, but also bee removers needs to be registered. Then the labeling of the honey, we need to make sure that we comply to certain acts. And we need to say where the honey is produced, whether it's choice grade or industrial grade, which is the country of origin. But exactly like what the film said, people are now chasing financial gains, and in doing so, you would get adulterated honey. I know from some of my colleagues in the beekeeping industry, There was in South Africa Chinese honey that was colorless, just plain water syrup honey that was mixed into pure honey just to be able to get and meet the demands that the consumers were wanting. And I think it's really unfair. The other thing is, as people start knowing that you're selling honey, I'd get requests like, oh, don't you have the 20 Rand honey? I was like, what? What are you talking about? We're not there to adulterate or to change that. And that's exactly what I believe in. I want to preserve what God created, because in that, in the honey, I believe there is a cure for many things, and not only the honey itself, but other entities from the bees and bees products, for example, the propolis. So I'm looking at it totally different than Joni. I'm looking at it purely from the perspective of preserving what God has created. And that's basically my story.
Thank you, Naeema. I'm not sure if you still wanted to share your screen, but that is now enabled if you wanted to take a minute or two to show us your presentation, or have you?
I can show you, I've put in some pictures, but I think the film's done really good on that. So I think we're good.
Okay, all right. Well, I mean, I just wanted to circle back to some of the comments that Joni was making around food sovereignty. And I mean, that was something that struck me quite dramatically, was the ability of well, not even small farmers, but just American farmers to survive in an industry that was getting inundated by a foreign market. And I just wondered if you could share some more thoughts around that, around food sovereignty as an issue in specifically here, the honey industry, but probably much broader as well.
Well, it was interesting to me that they sort of made China the bad guy. Mm. It was interesting to me that they didn't even touch on the almond industry. So the almond industry is not innocent. So not only are American beekeepers taking their bees from clear across the nation, from all over the nation, and bringing them to California to pollinate the almonds, and thus endangering the bees, lives. So they trace colony collapse oftentimes to the insecticides and fungicides that are being used to treat the trees. But not only that, but they're cutting down, and essentially raising acre upon acre upon acre upon acre to increase the number of trees that can be cultivated in the almond fields. And as they do this, they literally mow down all of the sort of indigenous flowers and flowering plants that used to grow in the fields. And so, and Naeema is sharing her screen, so that's great. So in terms of food sovereignty, I would just point to the fact that the almond industry is also not really innocent. So we can sort of look to China for some of the problems that we're seeing with adulterated honey. But when we think about colony collapse, essentially we need to be thinking about what might the almond industry be doing to support the bees. One of the things that they could do is not have barren ground underneath the trees. They could plant indigenous flowering plants. So there's so many sort of complications and deeper issues that the film might have touched on a little bit more clearly.
Thank you, Joni. I see, Naeema, you have shared your screen, so it would be great if you could talk through these images.
Perfect. I've got some. I'm just going to go through them really quickly. Basically, I explained to you why I got involved into beekeeping, and you'll see my thumbprint there, over there. Basically, I believe myself, or I see myself first as a Muslim, and obviously I looked at the Quran, and that was my first interest into the bees. And then as a South African, so with that, I needed to look at what our laws have. And there I put down two of the verses of the Quran which deal directly with the bees, and the one that says, and your Lord inspired the bee. So, I mean, that was what got me into it. I went into what honey was. I looked into the things. These are actually some of my own bees, and I wanted to single out because I have favorite ones, even though it looks weird to say that. And that's what it would look like when we're actually working with bees. And I've put the act that we deal with, so it's the Agricultural Pest Act, and what it deals with is it provides for requirements for import permits, or provides for control measures or prevention and penalties for non-compliance. But what it does not do specifically for beekeepers is deals with theft. What happens when our hives are being stolen? We've got nothing that regulates that. And then the control measures, which basically just deals with how our hives needs to be marked, how we need to manage our colonies responsibly, and all that, that beekeepers needs to be, bee removers needs to be registered as well. And that's basically one of my smaller colonies, which I've just caught, and I was busy doing a hive inspection in that. Then I looked at some of the other legislations that we'll deal with, which is grading, packaging, marking of bee products, food quality and importation requirements, honey production and extraction, specifically dealing, looking at the hygienic issues, the biodiversity and bee forage, municipal laws, where can our hives be kept, what are the laws relating to that, the taxes, because that is something that we also have to take into account when we look at the amount of income we make. So be it income tax, be it VAT, be it SDL or UIF or PAYE, all of those taxes, in terms of the employees that we employ, what are the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the basic conditions of employment. And then I just wanted you guys to look at some of the basic tools. This is spinning machine. And this is of some of the hives that were actually stolen. And you can see on there the DNW01. So that would be my number with I'm just not sure who's not. So that's a hive inspection that is being done. And that was bee or honey that we've just harvested through the frames. And it was all capped honey. And then I went into the labeling. I wanted you guys to see what the laws in South Africa deals with labeling in the terms of, we have to say where the country of origin is, whether it's raw honey, we need to say whether it's irradiated or the grade. We need to give the name of the product, the producer, the packer. If it's sugarcane honey, we need to state that, the date of packaging and the net mass of the weight of it. And then that was just of my tubs, the very first ones. And then basically what it's kind of evolved into what it looks like now. And this was my very first batch of honey that I actually ever removed safely myself. Yeah, and that's basically it. So that's what I was going to share with you.
Thank you so much. Those are some really lovely photos, and it's nice to see the context that you're working in. We've had a few interesting questions. I just want to see how we can end the screen share. Oh, there we go.
I'm stopping it. There we go.
Okay, thank you. I see we've had a few interesting questions while you've been giving your presentation. And one of the questions was for Joni, what, in light of Naeema's good explanation of the regulatory framework, or at least the applicable laws in South Africa around beekeeping, I wondered, I know that you're not a legal expert on beekeeping necessarily, but perhaps you could shed some light on what the regulations around the honey industry in the US would be.
No, I'm not an expert in beekeeping at all. I actually know more about chocolate. So I don't know if anybody has had the opportunity to look at the entire Rotten series. There's two seasons, and it looks at everything from avocados to chocolate to milk, and so I have more of a sense of general sort of trade agreement laws and fair trade agreement laws. And that's why I was saying that for me, I was disappointed that the filmmakers didn't talk at all about the ways in which different organizations, NGOs around the world are responding with, coming up with regulations that different producers would meet to say this product is fair trade, the labor that went into this product was given a fair, the laborers were given a fair wage. And so I look more at international, fair trade responses to try to keep beekeepers or chocolate makers or avocado farmers safe, safe from cartels, safe from murder, and safe in relationship to the environment from pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, etc., and to give consumers a way of responding, so that they know, for example, if Naeema's honey is for sale at this place and you buy it and you pay a little bit more, what you're paying for is an ethical practice, and what you're paying for is a culturally meaningful practice, and in Naeema's case, a spiritual practice. So you're paying a little bit more, and you understand that the cheaper honeys are probably adulterated with sugar. Somebody's probably, there's a reason why you're getting a cheaper honey. Usually it's because it's adulterated. So in other words, when you buy fair trade, you pay a little bit more. You pay a little bit more because you're supporting the farmers and you're supporting the practices that in turn support the environmental balances, instead of, like I said, with the almond farmers are completely ecologically out of balance with the ecosystem. And the film didn't look at that at all. It didn't question the almond farmers' practices at all. So yeah, I'm not an expert in beekeeping. I'm sorry for that. I'll have to sort of we'll have to defer to Naeema. There's another beekeeper in the room as well.
Yes, there was another. I saw in the chat there is another beekeeper in the session. Before we move on, I just wanted to touch on a question that Germany had around summarizing the ethical issues, and I see that you did put a response in the chat. But another thing that struck me about the film was even with fair trade regulation and even with more ethical practices, there's still, especially from a legal perspective, the regulation of it seems to be largely around bees and honey as a consumptive product, and just this emphasis on natural resources for commodification. And I just wanted, perhaps you could elaborate on the comment that you made around intergenerational justice and rights for bees, and taking a more eco-centric look at something like the bee industry, rather than, in terms of the South African legislation, as Naeema pointed out, it's all regulated in terms of, the Agricultural Pests Act, the Agricultural Products and Standards Act. Around, it's a product. It's not an intrinsic, it doesn't have rights in and of itself.
Yeah, the bee, the European honeybee is actually not indigenous to North America. So when the first European colonists came to the Americas, there were no bees, there were no honeybees. So the honeybees are an introduced species. They're introduced in part because they needed to be brought across the Atlantic to pollinate the crops that Europeans wanted to plant. So when we look around the world and we think about bees, sometimes I would say that many people around the world don't even know that bees, honeybees, European honeybees, are not indigenous to every place. And so when we think about one of the reasons, or several of the reasons that our corporate food system is out of balance with our ecological systems, sometimes it's because we're growing plants and foods that we shouldn't be growing. So for example, almonds are completely water-intensive plants. There's not enough water in California to be growing all those almond trees. So not only are they growing all those almond trees, and really it's not an ecological practice, they're bringing in the bees from all over the nation. And in many cases, they're collapsing the hives because the diseases are being shared among the bees. And, and also, you know, sometimes they get stolen, as we see from the film. You know, there are all these sort of illegal practices now around the bees. And so there are many food crops that are indigenous to the Americas that could be grown. So for example, when I learned all this about the almond industry, I switched to oat milk. So I try to stay away from almond milk because it's bad for bees. It's bad for the water situation in California, and it's more ecological for oats to grow because oats grow in, you know, just more easily, and they're, you know, less water intensive. So, you know, there's a lot of things we can do, and that's what I was saying about this particular series of films doesn't always give us sort of ways to respond. Like maybe they could be sued. You know, they could be sued by the almond growers if they say anything about almonds, or, you know, probably what they said and don't say does have something to do with the legal system.
Yes, that might be. I see we've got a couple more questions in our chat, and Naeema, I wanted to address the next two to you. Andrea had raised a question around a global trend that she guesses it's called, towards urban beekeeping, and whether you think South Africa's laws promote this. And I guess in that sense, does the regulatory framework facilitate urban beekeeping or beekeeping in general? And her second question was, do you think that theft in these areas, urban areas, would be less than in rural areas?
Okay. Firstly, when it comes to urban beekeeping, yes, it definitely is a global trend. However, I don't see our laws promoting that, because our municipal bylaws still have that bees are not supposed to be kept within urban areas and within a municipal district. So there are certain municipalities that have relaxed on those laws, the way I understand. However, it's not such that it's actually promoting urban beekeeping. But yes, I do feel that theft in those instances will definitely be restricted, or will be far less than in the rural areas. I mean, when we're out working on the farms, there's basically no lights. We're working out in the dark. We like using a red lamp or a red light, because the bees don't see that much. The more light they get, the more active they become. So definitely out in the rural areas, I think the chances for theft is much higher. So urban beekeeping is definitely something to look at, especially with the cities going green, or the green cities, and even the security complex is more environmentally friendly. I think it definitely is something that our law needs to get up to speed with.
Yes. And I actually just I had my own question, which I'm just going to ask because that's my prerogative as chair. But I mean, I don't know much about the South African bee industry. And, you know, I was wondering if you could share some perspectives on, are the people who keep bees largely subsistence scale, let's call it, as you are, or are they commercial bee?
Yes, there definitely are commercial honeybee or bee farmers that do it commercially. I think I just want to get the name correctly. In Douglas, if memory serves me correct, in the area around Douglas, there's actually a farmer that has over 1,000 or even 2,000 hives. So definitely it's there are commercial bee farmers. However, what does happen is, like the film pointed out, the demand for honey is so high that we within South Africa cannot produce enough to meet that demand. So definitely a lot of our honey is imported. And I always like to look at the labels of honeys in shops. It's just a habit I've picked up. And I'd like to see, it always says South African, but when you read at the back, it will say mixed with honeys imported from. And then I always have this quiet chuckle to myself and think, oh, what are they really doing? And that's something that really needs to be looked at, because yes, we have the laws regulating how the labels or what should be on the labels, but there's nobody actually checking up on that, because if you look at it, honey's not going to poison anybody. You know, it might be, if it's too sweet, it's just too sweet. That's what it is. It's so low on the priority of what needs to be checked up on that a lot of times it is such a big industry where people and consumers can be misled. just because it's not a priority to make sure that everything on those labels are 100% correct.
So do we not have the same in the United States? The testing is relatively rigorous around quality control and making sure that the honey doesn't contain particular additives, chemicals. Not the same here.
No, definitely not. I know Carte Blanche had run a series some time ago, I think it was about 2 years ago, where they actually did expose some of this honey that's been fake, and fake meaning it's been totally adulterated. What they have found is there was a 20% content as opposed to 80% adulterated mixture in it. And a lot of the honey that you find on shelves is actually that adulterated honey. So I know from the honey that I produce, which is raw, unheated honey, I just spin it out and I leave it. I don't like heating it. When you look at the consistency of that honey, and especially sunflower, I just wish I had a bottle with me right now, but it's as thick as ghee. If any of you would know what clarified butter is, it's like a spread. It's not, when you go to the shops, you look at the honey and it's all just one color. And I'm like, okay, something's wrong. Because every time you take out honey from a hive, the color changes. And when I put the different hives and I've just harvested that honey, it's always nice for me to take a picture and look at the different hues that actually come out of it, even though it's a sunflower field that I've harvested from. And that again speaks to me from what the Quranic verse says, from their bellies there is a substance of varying colors. And that tells me that, you can see that you can actually, when you're working with the bees and with the honey, you see those varying colors. And then I go to the shops and they all just look that same one color. And it doesn't matter what labels on it, they just same. And then I start wondering, that gets me a bit angry at times, to be honest.
I can imagine. I see there's a few questions here about why there was so much emphasis on the film on China. And Joni, I'm not sure if you would have any comments, given purely that it's an American film, and perhaps you can have a better perspective or a more insightful perspective on why that might be the case.
Well, Americans are always concerned about trade, and so we have a government agency called the Food and Drug Administration, and the history of our Food and Drug Administration is that in 1923, a book was written called The Jungle, and I don't know if any of you have ever had the opportunity to read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, but he was a journalist, and he saw that the meat industry, the cattle and beef industry, was becoming really corrupt and really unjust to the workers who were coming mostly from Eastern European countries. And so he wrote a novel that essentially laid bare the injustices of the meat system. And it was so powerfully received in America, and so many people read it, that Teddy Roosevelt actually had to form the Food and Drug Administration to start making sure that there were, there was cleanliness and, standards to process the meat. And since that time, we've gone completely lax. As you may be aware now, Americans have very few regulations around meat production, and all of these have been exacerbated by COVID. The meat packing plants have been just places where COVID has been really spread, because there's just anyway, it's just a big mess. So we've gone from having a drug administration that was highly catalyzed by literature, which is what I teach, and one of the reasons why I teach food sovereignty and food justice, using literature that has actually been key in helping to establish laws and regulations around food in the United States. But our Food and Drug Administration has also been just kind of like an advertising arm of the American government. So where it's supposed to be sort of protecting consumers, it's actually been a kind of sort of arm of the US government around the world to sort of sell our products, to sell our corn, to sell our wheat, to make sure it's our corn and our wheat and our rice that is being distributed in refugee crises and things like that. And so I think the focus in the film on China is a very American focus, because China is a huge competitor with America for in the food industry. So you all, I'm sure, are more aware than even me of the ways in which Africa is being divided by China and the United States for food production. So whether it's soy, whether it's rice, you know, so South America and Africa are still being neo-colonially divided for food production. So there's this huge competition between the United States and China. I don't know why filmmakers focused on China. I don't know if they're I don't know, but there was definitely that competition between China and the US reflected in this film.
Yes, at one stage they were talking about the dumping that was occurring from China and just effectively flooding the market and undercutting the US prices, which sort of speaks to what you're alluding to now as well. Just Peter had a question, which I actually see you've answered here, but whether survival of bee species is a concern. And I see that you have noted that it is definitely a concern for European honeybees, but that there are other indigenous species of bees. Yeah, and that we should know more about indigenous insects and plants. So participants who haven't read that, that's a very interesting comment from you there, Joni. And
so just to elaborate on that just a tiny bit, it's not always the case that we're always growing the right foods for our bioregions. So for example, almond trees are not really what should be growing in California right now. And as you look around the world and you look at all of us under climate change and the ways in which, you know, somebody mentioned that they did watch the avocado one, and the avocado one is so egregious because essentially these avocados have been planted up the sides of the hills, so that now the indigenous farmers at the bottom of the riverine system don't even get any water. So the cartels are up in the hills planting the avocado trees just so, you know, people can eat avocado toast. And down in the bottom of the river systems, they don't even get any water anymore. They now have to have their water delivered by water trucks. And so around the world, one of the things that we're doing very intensely, hopefully in the next 10 to 20 years, before 2030, it has to happen before 2030, is looking at what we're growing and where. And in Africa, for example, sorghum was always a famine food. And it was always the food that was grown when there was little water and drought. Well, there's a famine food everywhere in the world, and we should be planting more of our famine foods. So in the Americas, it's amaranth. In Africa, it's sorghum. There are different varieties of rice that take less water, different varieties of corn that take little water. And so instead of planting plants that maybe we shouldn't be planting, or that possibly have to have, you know, European bee pollination, maybe we should be planting other kinds of plants that are less water intensive and that perhaps don't even need to be pollinated by European bees. So I'm as concerned about bees as anyone. I love bees. Bees are amazing. They're so fascinating. But at the same time, we shouldn't necessarily be cultivating European plants everywhere because, you know, we've forgotten what was indigenous to a place.
Yes. And Naeema, perhaps you could elaborate on that in the South African context. What species of bee do we actually have here? Are they indigenous to South Africa, and are there threats from invasive bee species?
Yes, the invasive bee species is Capensis. I know that that's the one we try and get rid of, or we actually have to destroy the hive if we do get that. There are laws where we don't go across provinces and provincial borders just to make sure that we do not have invasive bee species. The American foul brood is also a disease that we really try and control and make sure. To be honest, I haven't gone into all the different species of bees that you do find. For me, if I'm just happy if I catch a swarm and they're doing their thing naturally. I don't want to go and invade into what they're doing. And like I said, my outlook is not to go and chase pollination or flowers or anything like that. I put my hives down and they carry on very normally. Let nature take its course. And that's the way I've been going ahead, because for me it's just preserving the natural order of things, and that's basically the way I've been handling it. We do see the numbers of bees, we do see swarming that does happen because our hives do get bigger, but then we put out other boxes to try and catch those swarms and create their newer colonies on their own. So from my point of view, it's definitely not from a commercial capitalistic point that the beekeeping takes place. It's basically just a hobby to try and get the survival of the bees on as much as we possibly can.
Thank you. I think I see what could potentially be one final question here from Peter, and Joni's just jumped ahead of me there. But Peter's question was, can it be said that the core issues apply across the foodscape, irresponsible exploitation of nature, of workers, of markets? And perhaps both our speakers would like to share their perspectives on that question.
So yes, I just typed an answer to Peter in the chat, and I would say that exploitation of workers and unjust and inequitable practices are rampant around the world. And in fact, you know, I can't emphasize enough how much this COVID pandemic is connected to climate change and inequitable practices in the food systems. So when you drill down to, you know, what's going on with the COVID pandemic, what you will find are these injustices. And also you will find the, this exploitation. I mean, the almond industry in California is an exploitation. It's a water exploitation, it's a land exploitation, it's a labor exploitation, and it's also a bee exploitation. And so the food justice and slow food movements want to sort of push back, and they you know, they want to ensure that workers and bees, worker bees, you know, multi-species, we have just and equitable multi-species relationships, not just with each other, you know, across us, but also with all of the other species that allow us to have our lives and to be human. We need to be thinking about justice for all of the species. And so in some cases that might be growing different plants in the next 20 years that allow us to have a continued, you know, delightful life. We should all be able to eat delightful foods, you know, but maybe paying a little more attention to where those foods come from. The urban beekeeping system in cities around the world is really in support of restaurants, so locally sourced restaurants. And so I think what you're going to see is a connection between multi-species justice and equity for workers and for different species, connected to more local food systems that work for, you know, the well-being of all species.
All right, thanks very much, Joni. And Naeema, I suppose you've actually answered, well, you've spoken a lot about this indirectly through the reason that you keep bees and certainly your spiritual connection to them. But perhaps you'd like to also just share your perspectives on those core issues about irresponsible exploitation, and maybe just from a South African perspective, or your own insights. Oh dear. Naeema has just... All right, we'll see if she rejoins in a moment. In the meantime, I ought to have said at the beginning that if anyone has questions that they'd like to pose, the floor, let's open the floor in the final couple of minutes to people. May raise their hands as a participant or simply put your questions in the group chat if there were any additional ones. No hands raised and no sign of Naeema.
I'm struggling to figure out the hand thing. I have so many things happening on my screen, but if I could just ask, we had a beekeeper, Mfundo, or someone involved in beekeeping, and I wonder if he had anything to add to what to the question you just raised around the core issues and what it's like to be involved in that sector, and how we can bring it to life a bit more. I don't know if he's still with us or if he would like to say something. I just wanted to invite him to do that.
Mfundo, are you still with us? No, but Patrick has said that he can chime in here. So Patrick, would you like to give us a word?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just juggling things. Yeah, just from a beekeeper's point of view, I stumbled into a hobby as well, and I've got one hive, and in fact another hive which arrived today actually. So it's a bit weird how it's all sort of been a bit synchronous, but just on the issues of beekeeping in general, I've found anyway, I know nothing about bees at all, but the hive almost looks after itself. It's an incredible organism, and the support that I've had from the local beekeeping community has been immense. So if anyone for a moment thinks that, oh, it's a bit scary to have bees, there's such an amazing community out there, and Naeema is just one example, I think, of how amazing these people are. So if you are keen, if you just reach out, there's local communities and organizations everywhere, and they're so happy to bring you a hive, set you up. And we had our first harvest, jeepers, about 3 weeks ago. And when someone brings out kgs of honey out of a box that's not much bigger than a meter by a meter, it is quite an incredible experience. So yeah, just from that point of view, if anyone is keen, I think it's just so easy to become a part of that dynamic and help the bees just have a few more hives in the areas where you might live. Maybe in the cities or in the inner cities, it might be a bit more difficult, but you don't have to be completely rural to have a hive.
That's really interesting. Congratulations.
Patrick, how do you manage some of the risks and like the fears around bees and the neighbors complaining and that kind of thing? What do you do to prevent that?
So I think I didn't tell anyone to start with. I think that was if I'd asked permission, I probably wouldn't have been given it, as it were, in terms of the court of public opinion. But once it's in, and I think people may or may not realize it's there, and weeks pass or a month passes, and no one's been attacked and there hasn't been any incident, they realize that in fact you're living with bees all the time. You just don't realize that the hive might be down the street or in that tree or under that drain culvert or whatever it might be. So from that perspective, people seem to be a bit more relaxed once they know it's been there for a bit of time. But also the beekeeping community are, and I know this might sound strange, but they're very in tune with the bees. So the hive that we have here, the beekeeper who comes and helps says, they're a bit cheeky and I've got to watch them. Whereas other hives are very relaxed, and you almost don't have to even wear a bee suit. So there are characters to particular hives. So you can, if the hive is one that is a bit agitated or can be a bit aggressive, then they take them away from your setting because they think they might present a risk, and move them somewhere else, and then bring a hive that's a bit more relaxed. So, but in terms of approaching the hive or interacting with the hive, there's quite strict protocols that they follow in terms of the suits and the little smoking device that they have. So it's all very well controlled from that perspective. So I don't think the risks are as scary as perhaps I thought they would have been until you've had experience of it. And then I think you'd become a little bit more relaxed with the whole process. It's very rewarding because effectively, they get treated as a domestic animal insofar as people farm them for honey, but you don't feed them, you don't inoculate them, you don't give them antibiotics, you don't have to take them to the vet. There's none of that added administration. They just take care of themselves. It's incredible.
That's wonderful. And I see Peter, who's the chair of our Environmental Law Association, has also popped onto the camera. Did you have a question, Peter? Or
yes. And I'd like to thank our speakers, Joni and Naeema. Thank you very much. It's been great. It seems that one gets the feeling that one gets about major issues like global warming, that it's huge, pervasive, and endemic. And the approaches are few and far between. And I suppose what Netflix is doing is raising awareness so that can perhaps lead to consumer resistance and eventually consumer movements that change broad demands and behavior of production. Regulation has its place, but it's not all that effective. What do you think?
Well, one of the reasons why I switched from a focus on climate change, which is broad, and which depends on statistics, which typically people can't see. We have the statistics, but they can't see the carbon in the air. And so when you then switch to food and the ways in which food and food systems are involved in climate change, people can they have a more, I guess you could say, physical connection, see a taste connection. And so when I start talking about the ways in which our love of wheat, our love of fat, salt and sour, and the different combinations we've innovated over 12,000 years, more than 12,000 years in our food systems, students begin to really relate. So no matter where they are from in the world, they usually have some kind of traditional food. And a first assignment in my class is trace the history, the food history of your traditional food. So whether that's seafood, whether that's seaweed soup or Swedish pancakes, students can usually trace all the ingredients to the original. Where does wheat come from? When did humans start eating seaweed? Why is seaweed soup so special? Why do you serve it in Korea for every birthday and every holiday? And then when you get really into the histories of these foods, you find that they have a nutritional history, but they also have sometimes a spiritual history, and they have a relationship between humans, soil, and water through time. And students start to begin to understand, there's dead carbon in the air because we burned it, and there's living carbon in the soil that we need. And how do we keep the carbon alive? And how do we keep the carbon in the soil where it needs to be so that we can grow nutritious plants? And so I agree that regulation might not be the best way to go, because if you can get people to understand why it is that we need the carbon in the soil instead of in the air, that does so much more than regulation. You know, it becomes a kind of motivation for people to do the right thing instead of, you know, a regulation to sort of force them to do the right thing. But that's a huge, huge challenge. Teaching people, you know, is a huge challenge. And so, yeah, the United States right now is just a hotbed of everything you don't want to happen in a nation. You know, people not wearing masks just because they don't want to be forced to wear masks through regulation. Yeah, we're sort of a hotbed right now of why sometimes regulations don't work.
Thank you, Joni. I see that we have Naeema back. I'm sorry we lost you for a moment there, but we were just, I had just posed the question to you about whether the core issues apply across the foodscape, and we've sort of been touching on, well, as Joni has greatly explained now, that's deeper role of the connectivity to food, of food sovereignty, and certainly Naeema's practice, the spirituality of what you do and the significance of that. And I guess, yeah, would you like to say any closing remarks about these core issues, or anything else that stands out for you in that regard as a small scale beekeeper?
No, not right now. I think I've missed too much. I was just too flabbergasted, sorry, trying to connect back again. So I'm just catching my breath back.
Oh, well, I'm pleased that you managed to join again. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. We've had both the blessings and the curses of digital meetings during this this presentation. Well, then, if I do see that it's already 9:05, and I think now might be the opportune moment to wrap it up. But oh, I see, Melanie, you've just. Would you like me to address that as well? Oh, and Joni answered it. All right. The question was around Joni recommending her best movies for environmental humanities teaching, and that's actually I'm glad we've recorded this, because that's something that I was also interested in knowing. So thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome. Yeah, I always start with Soylent Green. It's this super campy 1970s film, which looks completely dated to us today. But essentially, I tell my students, if you don't know Soylent Green, if you've never seen it, then you're uneducated about food systems. It's just a really super campy film, the last line of which you'll never forget. And everybody knows. It's kind of like a thing you can talk about at dinner parties. Have you seen Soylent Green? And what's the last line? But it is about food systems, and it does get people thinking about what will the world be like when it's hotter and drier, as it is becoming, and how will we respond to a hotter, drier world in ways that make the world less hotter and less drier. So yeah, changing our food systems, responding to climate change in ways that could maybe switch it around. We still have time to do that if we'll do it in the next 20 to 30 years.
Yeah. Thank you. So just thank you to both our speakers. We really appreciate your insights, and it's been really fascinating having the sort of, I would say, broader context from you, Joni, of food sovereignty and principles around that. And then it's complemented, it's so great, so wonderfully having you, Naeema, speaking directly to that small scale beekeeping that you do. So thank you to both of you. And just a reminder to anyone who is participating, who isn't an ELA member, do join. There are many benefits to being a member of our organization, not least of which is the weekly newsletter and further updates around our monthly screening sessions, which will certainly continue. But yes, thank you to everyone for participating again. And I'm so glad that we had another one of these sessions, which will definitely continue going forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
From my side as well, thank you very, very much to both our speakers and to Kate and to everyone who joined. And we will be doing this again last Tuesday of, it's the next month, July. So last Tuesday of July. And we hope you'll join us for that one. We'll put the details in our newsletter as well as on Facebook, and please feel free to join again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.